Kia ora koutou katoa. In this talk in the CCA lecture series, I draw on one of the key concepts in the CCA, communicative inequality, to witness the voices at the margins documenting a genocide in Gaza being perpetrated by Israel. Voices that have been erased, silenced, and delegitimized by the colonial racial capitalist infrastructure. Drawing on parallels between the famine currently being evidenced in Gaza and the Great Bengal famine that was witnessed in my ancestral land as a product of British colonial rule, I explore the linkages among communication, voice, famine, and genocide. The CCA offers us a theoretical anchor for exploring materiality, for examining the symbolic architecture that upholds and perpetuates material violence. In exploring the link between hunger and violence, not as abstract concepts, but as lived realities that tear through the bodies and spirits of communities in Gaza and Bengal, it is critical to attend to the communicative infrastructure of colonialism. Colonialism, working alongside the overarching imperial project, continually produces the other that must be the legitimate recipient of violence, which is intertwined with the processes of extraction, occupation, displacement, and expulsion. The communicative processes of othering build on the rhetoric of dehumanization, reducing the target of colonial violence into less than human through various communicative tropes. The colonized other is continually stripped of agency and is simultaneously crafted as a terrorist when she does demonstrate agency in resisting colonial violence. These dual communication processes of erasing agency on one hand and marking agency as terror on the other hand is critical to the perpetuation of colonial violence, to the production of famine, and to the broader project of colonial genocide, which is the systemic erasure of people. The CCA suggests that we decenter the hegemonic narratives of power that underlie the communicative infrastructure of colonialism and listen to those at the margins of the margins, those voices that exist at the traces of the margins. This act of listening holds the radical power for inverting the colonial logic and thus disrupting colonial violence. In other words, communication as voice and listening holds the transformative power for building social justice, for challenging the perpetuation of the intertwined processes of famine and genocide. Hunger is not just a lack of food. It is a form of material and structural violence, a structural assault on the most vulnerable, perpetuated by systems of oppression that thrive on communicative inequality. Inequality in the distribution of a variety of communication resources, from information to participation, voice, and decision-making. In the rest of this lecture, we will interrogate these systems, drawing parallels between Gaza and Bengal, and explore how communities resist through agency and voice, particularly attending to the powerful role of communication as a transformative resource. We will conclude with the argument that communication lies at the heart of building a just world. So the first theme looks at hunger as structural violence. Let's begin with the concept of hunger. In the CCA, we understand hunger not as a mere physiological state, as lack or deprivation, but as a marker of health disparity, a visceral embodiment of structural inequities. In other words, the deep inequities in structure are reproduced through the experiences of hunger that are embodied and physically felt. In Gaza, hunger is a weapon. The blockade crafted by Israel to cut off aid, ongoing since 2007, but really having a much broader, deeper, larger history to it, has choked the flow of food, medicine, and one would argue, hope. Over 1.8 million Palestinians face food insecurity, with children's bodies bearing the scars of malnutrition, stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and stolen futures. This is a calculated act of necropolitics, where the state decides who lives and who starves, where the state crafts a system of dispossession that actually works out who gets to have life and who is expelled from spaces of livelihood. The Israeli occupation, backed by global imperial powers, primarily the United States but also its allies, constructs Gaza as a laboratory of control, where hunger is deployed to break collective will, to break the agency of Palestinians to resist. The parallels with British colonial violence in Bengal are powerful here. The 1943 Bengal famine, in continuity with a large number of other famines that were produced through colonial policies in Bengal, a catastrophe that killed over 3 million people, was no natural disaster. It was a colonial construct engineered by British policies that prioritized wartime profits over Indian lives. Rice was diverted to feed soldiers and stockpiled for export, while Bengalis were left to die in the streets. The author Bhabani Bhattacharya's So Many Hungers captures this slow violence, where the colonial state and its capitalist allies turned food into a commodity, rendering the poor disposable. Our ongoing fieldwork in West Bengal demonstrates the ways in which hunger perpetuates in post-colonial India, carrying forth this colonial logic as a legacy of colonialism and of caste in post-colonial India. Food insecurity persists among many Adivasi or indigenous communities, particularly among Santalis, the community that I have worked with, where structural barriers, landlessness, poverty, and caste oppression keep hunger alive. What connects Gaza and Bengal across time and space is critical and worthy of noting. Both are sites of colonial racial capitalist violence, where hunger is not a failure of resources, but a deliberate outcome of power, evident in the patterns of distribution of resources, inequalities in who gets to have a say in policies, and broader communicative inequalities around participation and distribution of voice infrastructures. The CCA teaches us to interrogate these structures: global trade policies, military occupations, and neoliberal reforms that create scarcity and abundance. It also invites us to interrogate the ways in which aid is organized as a tool of dispossession and as a strategic tool in order to render voices invisible. In Gaza, the blockade restricts imports. In Bengal, colonial extraction, caste politics, and modern-day land grabs limit access to food. These are not isolated cases, but part of a global pattern where the global south is rendered a dumping ground for imperialist and neoliberal extremist agendas worked out around racialized lines. So, what is the relationship of this structural violence to the concept of communicative inequality, a key concept in the CCA? Violence in the CCA is material, physical, and communicative. This communicative dimension of violence is really critical. The communicative dimension of violence is critical to learn and to note when considering questions around justice and when thinking through issues of food around questions of justice. Injustice and its corollary, violence, are perpetuated through the erasure of voices at the margins, the silencing of narratives, and the imposition of hegemonic meanings over discursive spaces. Note here the ongoing deployment of the terror trope to perpetuate terrorist and terrorizing violence. While communities that are recipients of large-scale imperial terror are marked as terrorists, the terror continues to be perpetuated through various policies that engender deprivation of food and basic material resources. In Gaza, the mainstream media in colonial imperial structures, including here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, frames Palestinians as terrorists. stripping them of humanity and justifying their starvation. Once Palestinians have been stripped of agency, then these same communicative structures construct Palestinians without agency, without the capacity to have a voice as passive recipients of aid. This communicative violence legitimizes the blockade, normalizes airstrikes, normalizes the violent targeting of those seeking aid at aid sites, and erases simultaneously the stories of families and communities scavenging for food under the rubble and often being targeted for seeking out aid. Now, the CCA demands that we listen to Palestinian voices. Children who demand their right to food, mothers who ration bread, youth who organize soup kitchens, and elders who narrate resistance through poetry. These are all acts of agency. And attending to these acts of agency is one of the most powerful communicative acts in terms of disrupting the colonial violence. These voices challenge the colonial narrative and assert agency in the face of annihilation. In Bengal, the 1943 famine was accompanied by a silencing of the subaltern. The colonial state dismissed the deaths as natural, while the voices of the starving, peasants, laborers, oppressed caste communities, and women were buried under official reports. Even in contemporary West Bengal, the Santali people's articulations of hunger as a health crisis are ignored by policymakers who prioritize biomedical solutions, top-down solutions, without really attending to the need for structural transformations. My ongoing work with Santali communities over the past 2 decades reveals how they define health through food insecurity, land rights, cultural dignity, and the dignity of indigenous knowledge. Yet these very meanings are erased by a neoliberal health system that pushes individual behavior change over questions of collective justice. In the context of food insecurity, consider, for instance, the ways in which the dominant narratives around food insecurity failed to address these broader structures of colonialism, racial capitalism, and ongoing neoliberal transformation of the globe. The CCA exposes this communicative inequality as a form of violence. When the powerful control the narrative, they dictate what counts as a crisis and who gets to be heard. In both Gaza and Bengal, the subaltern are rendered voiceless, their experiences reduced to statistics or stereotypes. But the CCA flips this script, it turns it on its head. It centers the agency of communities to define their own problems and solutions, challenging thus the top-down, expert-driven models of intervention, challenging the turning of the Palestinians into people without agency. This recognition of agency is critical to the dismantling of the infrastructures of violence. So the next section turns to questions of agency and resistance and the importance of listening to the voices of the margins. One of the core concepts of the CCA is agency, attending to subaltern agency as it is enacted against erasure. The subaltern is not relegated to the past as an object of analysis once the genocide has been completed, but rather as an ally in the struggles against the violence of erasure. The role of the academic in this sense is not just about tracing the erasures, but it is about actively co-creating, collaborating, partnering to explore the ways in which voice infrastructures can be co-created to transform these driving structures of oppression. In the CCA, agency is not an abstract concept, but a material practice. Communities at the margins co-creating solutions to their struggles based upon their everyday lived experiences. This seeing of, this witnessing of the everyday lived experiences through voice infrastructures, a core concept of the CCA, becomes a way in which the organizing patterns of violence are disrupted. In Gaza, Despite the blockade, grassroots movements continue to thrive. Community kitchens led by women distribute meals to thousands. Farmers cultivate rooftop gardens under siege. Often they cultivate gardens under rubbles. Often they turn to ways and practices of growing food amidst the destruction. These acts of resistance are not just about survival, they are fundamentally about hope, they are about reclaiming dignity, and about asserting the right to life. This act of reclaiming dignity resists this continual work of erasing and dehumanizing the voices from the margins. The CCA, thus, through its work with voice infrastructures, amplifies these voices through solidarity, recognizing these voices as knowledge producers who challenge the necro-capitalist logic of starvation. In Bengal, the Adivasi people, the Santalis, have long resisted structural violence through cultural practices, through knowledge making practices, and collective organizing. Our work at CARE with the Voices of Hunger projects in Bengal over the last 2 decades shows how communities use a variety of storytelling methods, draw upon their voice infrastructures through photo exhibits, photo voice exhibitions, community meetings, art, storytelling, performances to demand food security. They reject the charity model of food aid that reproduces the neoliberal structure, which continues to dehumanize them, which continues to reduce their agency, and in turn call for land reforms and access to traditional food systems. They call for ways in which their access to their land, their ecosystems can be safeguarded so they can have sovereignty over these spaces in growing food. They're not passive victims. They challenge, in fact, the narrative of passive victimhood and instead demonstrate the ways in which, as active agents, they rewrite the narrative of hunger as fundamentally a call for social justice. Both Kazaa and Bengal teach us that resistance is communicative, it is symbolic, and that symbolic capability to articulate voice forms the basis for structural material transformation. It is the haka in Aotearoa, New Zealand Parliament, the poetry of a Palestinian child, the writings of a Palestinian academic, the songs of Santali elders that challenge the violence of active communicative erasure perpetuated by interplays of various oppressive forces, patriarchy, caste, cisnormativity, settler colonialism, imperialism, and in its current form, neoliberal capitalism. These acts of voice disrupt the silence imposed by power and create spaces for transformative change. In this sense, the CCA is both a theory and a methodology for co-constructing solutions with communities, rooted in their lived experiences and cultural meanings. Voice reclaims knowledge, centers stories of resistance, and cultivates hope through material practices of resistance. I will now turn to the theoretical contributions of the CCA to this conversation on hunger and violence. The culture-centered approach is a radical departure from traditional communication theories that look at the ways in which then we can deploy communication to better distribute resources from the top to the bottom. It rejects the universalizing assumptions of Western models that treat culture as a barrier to be overcome. This celebration of agency of the colonized becomes the basis for imagining solutions that are rooted in everyday lived struggles. The CCA places culture at the center, recognizing it as a dynamic site of meaning making, negotiating power, talking back to powerful structures, and finding ways of both surviving amidst these powerful structures but also bringing about transformation to these structures. Structure, culture, and agency, the 3 key concepts of the CCA, are thus interwoven. Structures of colonialism and capitalism shape hunger and violence, and at the same time, culture provides a lens through which communities come to understand and resist these structures, often drawing upon knowledge systems that they have held. And agency is the capacity to act, speak, and transform. Voice, as an expression of agency, becomes the basis through which transformative spaces are built. Our work at CARE has shown how this framework disrupts the neoliberal health and development paradigms. So in Gaza, the question is not about how aid from the West, the very West that has perpetuated this violence, can bring about solutions, but instead it is fundamentally about rejecting these top-down programs that ignore Palestinian voices, erase Palestinian agency, and instead find ways of supporting community-led initiatives through voice infrastructures at the grassroots in communities, supporting initiatives like mutual aid networks and programs that are emergent in Gaza through the struggles of the people. In Bengal, the CCA, as a framework for listening to voices in communities, challenges both the biomedical focus on nutrition supplements and on top-down solutions that serve the needs of the market, to advocating for questions of land rights as a health interventions, to questions of cultural rights of Adivasi and indigenous people, to the questions of food sovereignty as a cultural right as the basis for transforming these structures. The CCA then, at the heart, is about communicative justice, ensuring that the marginalized have a seat at the table, that the marginalized have those communicative and voice infrastructures through which they can articulate their voices and make their knowledge claims, not as beneficiaries of top-down interventions where those in power hold control, but as co-creators of knowledge and co-creators of solutions. Let's now turn to the comparative insights that emerge as we place Gaza and Bengal in conversation with each other. And I would argue that this kind of comparative analysis is really important to understand the local, to understand the cultural context and the cultural systems through which agency is expressed, but also then to see the convergences and synergies between them, and then to work through these synergies to build global infrastructures for decolonization and anti-colonialism. Comparing Gaza and Bengal through the CCA lens reveals both shared struggles and unique contexts. So these comparisons offer us the basis for drawing out themes, threads, connections. And these connections are critical to suturing or putting together solidarities across spaces. Both regions face hunger as a form of slow violence, but also as a form of fast violence as reflected in Gaza, rooted in colonial legacies and ongoing settler colonial violence, and sustained by global inequalities brought about by extractive neoliberalism. In Gaza, as I noted earlier, the violence is immediate. It is militarized. It is supported by a military industrial infrastructure that is legitimized every day. And particularly so as we go through digital revolutions globally, these digital infrastructures are mechanized in order to perpetuate this violence. In Gaza, these forms of violence are visible in terms of both techniques and technologies of surveillance, but also the precision technologies or technologies that are described as precision technologies to carry out the violence. Although, as we see, these technologies are hardly precise in the sense that they are broadly used to target women, to target children, to target communities at the margins, often using the narrative of terror. In Bengal, this violence too is historical. And this history of the violence makes it structural, and often, therefore, the nature of the violence in post-colonial Bengal is invisibilized. We don't really get to see the violence in the workings of the material forms of colonialism, caste, and racial capitalism. Yet, both communities demonstrate resilience through collective agency, the enactment of everyday agency. Gaza through grassroots survival strategies, Bengal through cultural resistance and advocacy. The CCA highlights how these struggles are interconnected with each other. The same neoliberal capitalist system that profits from Gaza's blockade fuels land grabs in Bengal, generating profits through the ongoing consolidation of land under the purview of global capital. The same communicative violence that dehumanizes Palestinians silences the Santalis and more broadly the Adivasi peoples of India. The CCA also shows us hope by centering subaltern voices, by demonstrating the possibilities that are co-created through voice infrastructures. We can build solidarities across these different contexts, learning from each other's resistance to create a global movement for food justice and human rights. It also calls upon any of us working on questions of hunger and food insecurity to speak out, to respond to our commitment to action by turning our bodies into sites of articulation. So I conclude by calling for just action and by suggesting that one of the key imperatives of the CCA is to speak out, is to talk back, is to raise our voices at the current juncture in spite of the various modalities of silencing that are put in place. The culture-centered approach is not just an academic exercise in this sense, it is a call to action. Hunger and violence in Gaza and Bengal are not inevitable. They are products of systems that can be and must be dismantled. We must listen to the voices of the margins, not as powerless objects of pity, but as agents of change. And these acts of listening are ethical calls for us to respond as these voices emerge from the margins. We must recognize that colonial violence is rooted in the erasure of agency. And that's why the act of listening to voices from these colonized margins is radical. It is radical in its call for fundamentally disrupting these silences. But because it is radical, the ongoing structures, if you think about the colonial structures globally, are bent upon silencing these acts of listening and voicing. So we must turn to our courage, turn to our bodies to find ways of securing courage to talk back and speak in solidarity with the voices. The communicative acts of witnessing agency and listening to voices from the margins hold the power to dismantle settler colonialism, imperialism, and racial capitalism. A just world is not only possible, but it exists right within these voices that are being articulated. We must challenge the colonial capitalist structures that perpetuate scarcity and silence as if both scarcity and silence are normative. And we must build communicative infrastructures, be they community spaces, community dialogues, community meetings, policy briefs, art, performance, cinema, digital stories, advocacy, and activism that amplify subaltern solutions through our local, regional, and global networks of solidarity. The Gaza moment tells us that our voices matter and our voices are making a difference, and all the more reason why we must continue speaking up and speaking out. As I offer these insights into violence and hunger, I'm reminded of a Santali elder who once told me in my fieldwork, and I quote, "Hunger is not just an empty stomach, it is an empty voice," end quote. And this narrative offers the hope for the culture-centered approach. In Gaza, in Bengal, and across the global south, let us commit to filling that silence with the roar of resistance, with the voices that demand justice, because the world we must envision has to be a just world. Let us co-create a world where no one starves, where no voice is erased, and where justice is not a dream but a reality we build together. Namahi Nui.